Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Tom Pepper and today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to go over some of the political terminology that I use quite often, just sort of to set the stage and provide a background for everything else I'm talking about whenever I discuss politics. Particularly, we're going to look at left and right wing, which are terms that come up so often that I feel like people don't necessarily address them or what they mean, because they kind of think, like I did, I'll assume people sort of get the gist of what I'm saying. But I do think it's important to go into these terms in depth, just so we have a good understanding of what we're talking about. This topic was suggested in a comment by Babudro's son, so please, if you have anything you'd like me to look at, leave a comment below. Anything you'd like me to explain, any debate or debater you'd like me to analyse, very happy to do that for you. And this video is going to be in two parts. The first part, I'm going to look at the practical side of what we mean when we say left and right wing, which will be mostly looking at where politicians and political groups fall on the sort of scale. Going to look at some graphs and charts and things to illustrate that. And then the second half, we're going to do the theoretical side of things. So the underpinnings, why are certain groups left wing and why are certain groups right wing? So like, what criteria do they need to qualify for one group or the other? I guess by analogy, you could say if someone asked you what is a superhero movie, you could just list superhero movies like X-Men, Spider-Man, Avengers, or you could tell them the details about what it is that makes any movie a superhero movie or not, if that makes sense. So part one is just the listing of the groups, and part two is the theoretical underpinning that makes sense of that. As well as the generalities of left wing and right wing, I'm going to look at particular phrases as well, like alt-right and SJW, just to see if they're useful and meaningful, or if they have just become insults that don't really have any use to them, outside of insulting people. Let's get started on left wing and right wing. I've taught politics before for years, political philosophy and straight politics, and I don't think I ever addressed this question with any of my groups. It's weird because you feel like this should be the underpinning, right? Like this should be the first thing you learn because it feels so fundamental. Like there's two groups, there's left and right. But in fact, it's the kind of thing you can only really understand once you understand all the different groups. But let's go to our first little graph thing and see where the groups fall on this spectrum. I expect this might be quite controversial. If you disagree with any of it, do leave a comment below. But I've just tried to do my best to, in an unbiased, neutral kind of way, show where I think they fall on the left-right spectrum. Here we can see in purely practical terms then what this graph of mine looks like. And again, this is all, I wouldn't say it's subjective, it's not entirely a matter of opinion, but it's kind of vague. The concepts are loose around the edges. I would call it intersubjective, which means it's the kind of thing that becomes true because everyone agrees it's true, like the value of money or the order of the days of the week. So I don't think anyone could really deny that Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn are left wing. I think if you say they're right wing, you've either got a lot of explaining to do or you're probably just wrong. But like, are they exactly the same? Are Corbyn and Bernie as left-wing as each other? There's no real fact of that matter. So I just put them in the same sort of place here. As we can see, we've got the progressive activists like BLM on the far left. Then we've got socialists, which we put roughly around the Justice Dems like AOC and Bernie. Socialists here are represented by Jeremy Corbyn, who was, until a few years ago now, leader of the Labour Party in the UK. The UK Labour Party is now under new management and has gone to the right, closer to the centre. Just to the left of centre, I've put the establishment Democrats, Biden, Hillary, Obama, Pelosi. They might be in slightly different places. I haven't put them in the exact centre, which I've reserved for the UK Lib Dems and people I've just labelled centrists, who normally have a political belief that falls somewhere between the two extremes. There might be some disagreement there. Maybe you think the Democrats are about where the Lib Dems are, but again, it's a rough chart. Then right of centre, you've got the Republicans, Fox News, the Conservatives, led by Boris Johnson currently. I'd say they're all in about the same basket. Trump, I'd say, is to the right of them. I think I'm right in saying that Fox News is supportive of the Republican Party, but not so much Trump. And I've put a little question mark next to Trump because figuring out that man's sort of political motivations are incredibly difficult. So I've sort of lumped him in with the alt-right as a further right politician. And then on the far right, you have the libertarians. There's a few of them in the UK around the fringes, but mostly I'm thinking of the Americans, especially like the Tea Party Americans, who I don't really think are a force anymore. Libertarians are people that want the state to be as small as possible. So the state shouldn't fund anything, private business should run everything, and you should give all liberty to private individuals, which often ends up looking like you're giving all liberty to private business, but we won't get into that now. So that's where most of the political groups fall. One thing to note, I've included UK and US politicians. UK politics is just to the left of American politics. I'd say pretty definitively, like, our left-wing politicians are further left than American left-wing politicians, and our right-wing politicians are further left than their right-wing counterparts. So it's just a shift. One term here I wanted to go into in a bit more detail. We have a Conservative Party here in the UK, and there's also conservative political philosophy, which might be separate to that. In America, you also have conservative ideology, but not a Conservative Party. Conservative can be confusing because it's a relative term. A conservative is basically someone that wants to keep things the same. And as a result, you can actually get left-wing or right-wing conservatives theoretically. Because if you had a hippie utopia that lasted for 1,000 years and it's all, free love and whatever, and they had a politician who didn't want things to change from that hippie utopia, that person would be a conservative, right? Because they don't want things to change. So in the recent presidential election, Trump, at least oratorically, is talking about quite radical, sweeping changes, right? So Trump was actually not that conservative because he wanted to make a lot of big changes. He was more of a radical, but conservatives voted for him. Biden, meanwhile, kind of posed himself as a progressive, but most of his platform was actually, we want to return to the Obama years. So he's a conservative, if not actually a regressive, that the progressives voted for. And you see how confusing this all gets, especially around conservatism, because Margaret Thatcher is one of our most famous conservative prime ministers, but she wasn't that conservative at all. She was a radical that made great sweeping changes. We'll go into all of this in more depth, but that's kind of where the problems lie. You've got all these sort of interacting, relative or kind of subjective, vague terms that can leave people very confused, especially if you start using terms as an insult. To some Americans, it just feels like people on the right will always be conservatives, even when they're pushing for quite radical right-wing change. Because conservative is just the term they use to refer to right-wing people now. So it's all quite confusing. We'll try and go into it in more depth. I imagine what most people will want out of this video is just like a practical guide for how to survive day to day, right? How to just get through political conversations and understand political content. So here's just a summary of what I think the left in the West are mostly about. So they are pro-business, maybe not as pro-business as the right, but generally they are capitalists. They think that society should be run by private business with the state there to lend a helping hand. To achieve this, they tax private business and spend it on public services, transport, benefits, the military, fire services, and maybe healthcare, obviously a contentious issue in America, but generally they're more keen on that kind of thing. They think the government can and should solve social inequalities, and we've seen that a lot with the BLM protests. A lot of them are about showing how the outcomes for black people in America are worse than the outcomes for white people, and they think the government should actively intervene to fix that. They are usually pro-immigration. Immigration is one of the big dividing lines at the moment, and this plays into their globalism. They are outward-looking. They want their nation to interact with other nations. So for the US, I mean, Trump was quite nationalistic. He wanted to sort of focus entirely on America. The Democrats didn't want him to do that because they were further left. And the UK has just left the EU, which was a big sort of, not a global initiative, but a step towards globalization, which the left were far more keen on than the right in general. And this last point then, I'd say, is a pretty good summary of the West and left. The state can and should help people while still being very much committed to capitalism. The far left is still an active force in British and American politics as well. You have people like Corbyn, they're sort of out of power in the UK Labour Party now, but there's still that sort of vibe, and Bernie and AOC and the other sort of Justice Dems or Progressive Dems in America. They're usually differentiated by their attitude towards business. They want higher taxes, more spending on public services. They basically think government should be more active. So on this sort of left-right distinction, in practical terms, one really good way to look at it is the right want business to run things, and the left want the state to run things. And the centrists sort of want a combination of the two. But Bernie and Corbyn, being to the far left, want the state to run things. They might want nationalisation. So Corbyn wants to nationalise rail. I'm pretty sure Bernie wants to nationalise healthcare so the state takes care of it. and not a private business. And this is what you might call socialism, normally a soft kind of socialism where we still function like a capitalist country, but there's a lot of tax and spend, a lot more workers' rights, possibly trade unions as well to enforce those workers' rights. That's the sort of active far left platform in the West currently. And here's the Western right as well in practical terms. They generally want to let business do its thing almost entirely. Like the American far right libertarians really seem to want to strip back the state, the government, as much as possible and just let private interests run things because they think that profit is the best way to motivate people to achieve good outcomes. They generally don't like taxes, and they think that if you just let people keep their money, you don't tax it off them, they can then spend it on private healthcare, which can also flourish because they can reinvest and not pay taxes. So the distinction is kind of that people on the left would like everything to be run by the state and maybe free to access, and people on the right just think, well, if you give everyone enough money, it won't matter that it's not free because everyone will be rich and they'll be able to buy into these possibly expensive public services. Again, this is a really vague generalization, but you get the idea. The right, generally, another big dividing line, prefers individual rights to social goods. So when we talked earlier about how some of the progressive Dems might want the government to step in and solve social inequalities, the right are generally against that. They think that unequal outcomes are just a product of the system. They can't be avoided, and the only way to avoid them would be to structure society to achieve those goals, which one, they don't think the state would be very successful at doing, and two, they don't think the state could do it all without trampling over individual freedoms. The right is usually more nationalistic. They're proud of the nation state. They want it to be strong, inward-looking. They're normally more patriotic, and that doesn't always play into policy as much. I know the Tories upset some people by saying they want the Union Jacks flown over buildings, and the Welsh are all very unhappy about that. But patriotism, it's just kind of the outward face of nationalism. They're usually a lot more anti-globalist on the right. So obviously Johnson's Tories have taken the UK out of the EU, which is a big multinational organisation. And Trump was also hostile to big sort of global initiatives. Like he didn't like the UN, and he stopped giving payments to the World Health Organization, which worked out real well for everyone. And again, immigration, hot button issue. I mean, the right talks a big game about immigration. My understanding is that immigration has continued to go up under 4 years of Trump and under 10 years of the Tories in Britain. So although it's something they'll often talk about, it's not often reflected in policy, I don't think. So opposed to the left wanting the state to help people, the right think the state should not interfere in people's lives. It thinks people would be so much better off if the state just stepped away and let people do their thing. In its most extreme forms, libertarians can think there should be no state, no government at all. Everything should be private business. But I think the Americans are basically committed to a state that funds policing and the military. There doesn't seem to be a big difference left and right on policing or military. I mean, the left likes softer sentences and things, but basically they're committed to the function of those services. One thing I wanted to clarify for the right wing is that while I do think there are active far left forces in the UK and the US, like socialists like Corbyn and Sanders, not saying that's a bad thing, the charge often leveled at the far right to sort of counter this is that they are fascists. I don't believe that's true. I wouldn't describe any UK politician as a fascist or even close. I don't think there's been any fascist UK politician in decades. America, I'm less familiar with. It might be there are some actual fascists who don't believe in individual rights and want a big, powerful state to control everybody's lives. That never seemed like the problem for me from Trump and that sort of far right crowd. They are far right, like Nazis and fascists are, but they're not the same thing, right? And that's why these graphs get so confused sometimes, because you'd like it to be sort of a nice flat line from the left like a big state and the right like a small state, but also in fact the right sometimes is keen on a big powerful state, a fascist state that really gets involved in your life. Trump wasn't like that. He didn't want to control Americans' lives through the state. He wanted to do the opposite and roll the state back and not help people when they needed it. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think it was a bad thing. But the criticism that he was fascist or that the Republican Party is fascist, I don't think is justified. That just seems like a slur. The alt-right then, which I guess you could call Trump a member of that group, they're kind of what you would call civic nationalists, it seems to me. So their main thing seems to be on immigration. They don't like immigrants coming into the country in too great numbers. They like patriotism and nationalism and that America first mentality. So it's a small state, but with hard borders. So it's difficult to get into the state, but once you're in, you get all the wonderful benefits of being an American citizen. You can see there as well, the alt-right are very keen on social freedoms for its citizens, especially free speech. And this is another sort of big flashpoint that's come up lately. They feel that people are being punished in work or online for saying the wrong kind of thing, and they tend to think that people should be allowed to say whatever they want. And in its current form, the alt-right is at least more sort of coherent than the Tea Party, which looked to be controlling the Republican Party, I guess a decade or two ago now, because they were very big on libertarianism and saying, oh, we don't want the state to get involved in our lives, hands off our guns. But then they also wanted the state to ban gay marriage and be really harsh on drug offenders and all this other weird stuff that came from the religious right. That element seems to have dropped out of power, and now the alt-right has sort of a more coherent view of civic nationalism, which is keep immigrants out, and then once everyone's in our country, don't tell them what to do because they're Americans, and Americans love their individual freedoms. Is then a lot of this terminology just abusive? Does it have any kind of real weight to it? I mean, you might still be, I'm coming to near the end of the video now, you might still be confused about what left-wing and right-wing is exactly. Hopefully I've given you some grounding for what it is, but like I say, it's just the kind of thing you need to pick up by example and by osmosis, because there's no set definition for it. I mean, I'm going to go into theory in the next video, and that should really help. But for now, I'd say left and right wing are useful terms. I mean, if you're going to say someone's far left or far right, you might be trying to scare someone off their kind of beliefs. But it still has a definite referent. I know what people mean when they talk about far left politicians and far right politicians. So I think that's helpful at least. Alt-right as well, I'd say there is a definite distinction between alt-right personalities at least and sort of more traditional Republican conservatives. The split can probably be most clearly shown maybe with the attack on the Capitol, the riot that happened there, which sort of conservative traditional Republicans hated because they're so patriotic and they love their buildings, and they're very much committed to maintaining these systems. The alt-right is very much of a sort of tear it all down mentality, except for ICE and immigration enforcement officers. And so that kind of clear distinction, I think alt-right, even though it is used as a scare word, is still useful. It does mark out a definitive group. And I'd say SJW does the same for the left. If I say, oh, Joe's coming to the party tonight, Joe's in SJW, you probably have a pretty good idea of what I'm talking about, even if you can't, technically define the term. Part of the problem is that this is just inevitable that these terms become slurs, because if you're on the left, you genuinely won't like right-wing views, right? Pretty much by definition. And let's say you particularly dislike conservative views, right? People who want to keep things the same. After a while, you're just going to start referring to policies from that side as just conservative, and you'll probably start writing them off as conservative. And if you're a YouTube personality, you're probably going to hope that your viewers share the same ideals you do, so you don't have to criticize anything in any depth. You can just call it conservative. And so in that way, conservative starts to become an insult, because you don't need to go in depth into why the policies are bad every time the word conservative does the job, right? Or, progressive. People might try and scare you by saying progressive, but ultimately, whenever right-wing people are talking about communists and left-wing people are talking about fascists, that's just scare tactics. There's no actual communists or fascists in Western politics. But if you're wondering about your own political ideology, I would say always start with the policies. So work out what policies you'd like to see, what role do you want government to play, should government interfere with people's individual freedoms and lives, should government interfere with the workings of business, and then work out which party best represents you. Don't get too bogged down in the labeling and I want to be a left-wing person, so I'll believe in the policies. Policy will always be the most important thing, so start from there and then work out which political movement you would like to be a part of. That's it for part one of the practical terminology seminar, looking at where the political movements fall and some common characteristics. But you might still have some questions like, why are those groups on the left instead of the right? What actually defines those terms? Is it all just relative, or is there something underpinning it? You might be wondering why it is that fascist societies are taken to be right-wing and communist societies are taken to be left-wing, even though they can often look very similar, or why libertarians who don't like the state are on the right, and why anarchists who don't like the state are on the left. Well, hopefully all that and more will be explained in part two. I'm going to look at the theory underlying it and try to comprise a definition of left and right wing into which those groups can neatly fall. For now, I've been Dr. Tom Pepper. Please leave a like if you liked the video, share it with anyone you think might like it, and leave a comment below if there's anything you'd like me to explain further, or any different videos you'd like me to analyze, any topics you'd like me to explore, anything like that. Until next time, have a good one. Goodbye.